Step into the squared circle, where the bell echoes through decades, where main events become legends and tag teams tore the house down. From the undercard to the top of the card, this is Portland Wrestling at its finest. One ring, one city, 1,000 stories. This is Ringside in Rose City. And here's your hosts, Frank Culbertson and Mike Rogers.
Hey, thanks, Lisa, for that great introduction. Mike and I appreciate it. I'm Frank Culbertson, and I'm here with
Mike Rogers.
And you're listening to Ringside in Rose City. One ring, one city, 1,000 stories. And tonight, we're about to uncover more gems. See, this is a place for Portland wrestling history, the matches, the people, and the moments that made this territory special. Now, Mike and I don't choose the topic, well, except for this time. You know, we had such a great time talking about the interviews and excitement in the air, the Voices of Northwest Wrestling Volume 3 last week. And truthfully, we had a list of more interviews from the book that we really wanted to discuss. And so we've decided to do a second podcast on those interviews. They're still on the list because these are guys we really need to be remembering and really honoring. So tonight, Lisa, you don't have to spin the wheel. Is that going to be okay with you?
No problemo.
Ooh, Mike, I'm glad it's no problem because we don't want problems with Lisa. She can crack a mean whip when provoked, and I've got the marks to prove it. And so with that, Mike, let's talk about Eric Red Donovan.
Yeah, Red Donovan was part of a brother tag team, his legitimate brother, Doug Donovan. They wrestled as the Donovan brothers. Doug Donovan became more well-known as one of the Von Bronner brothers who traveled around. Red Donovan became kind of the substitute Von Bronner brother. He was known as Eric Von Bronner. And so when one of the original Von Bronners left the team, Red probably teamed up with his brother, and they went from the Donovan brothers to the Von Bronner brothers.
And, you know, they also wrestled, and, you know, I love masked wrestlers. He also wrestled as one half of the Misfito and Dante team. If you see a picture of that, those are great masks. It's like when the Medics and all those teams were wearing masks that were really spectacular. I really like that. He talks about an incident in Albany, Oregon in 1956. Now, his wrestling career was from 1955 to 1967, so he never wrestled at the Portland Sports Arena, so fans of that era don't recognize that. But he was in an incident. He couldn't wrestle because he had boils, and so they wouldn't let him wrestle. He sat in a chair by the dressing room so that people could see that he was really injured. So it wasn't just making up a promoter saying, oh, he's not going to wrestle tonight or he's not here. He actually was there to show that he was injured. There was a woman in the crowd, not ringside Rosie, and he said, I felt like she was up to no good. She kept wandering around, pacing back and forth, and come up to the ring on several occasions. And he said, we weren't popular with the fans, so they always knew to watch their backs. He says, this woman walked halfway around the ring, and she turned and jabbed my brother in the leg. I love this part. His instinctive reactions were to turn and brought up his foot, and Lord, she cleared out 4 or 5 rows of chairs. I think it was more of a push than a kick. There was a pretty fair lawsuit over it. It turns out that it was a hairpin, and it was several inches long. They got it thrown out of the court in Albany because they weren't citizens, and so they could move it, and there was a settlement. But he said there were lawsuits all the time going around at that time for interactions with fans.
Yeah, and that story appeared in the book, Whatever Happened to Gorgeous George by Joe Jars, whose dad was Frank Jars, the wrestler. I found that really interesting that it was in that book. And then we talked about checking to see if that was a true story. And he admitted that it was. I also love the rib. Vic Christie is, if you talk to old timers, Vic Christie is the king of ribs, of funny, gentle ribs that don't hurt anybody. Red Donovan talks about a rib that he played. He put on his ring jacket, and then somehow Vic Christie had attached a clothes hanger and then put ladies' undergarments on the clothes hanger. And so when Red Donovan is walking around the ring, everybody's laughing at him because he's got a clothes hanger with ladies' garments hanging, and he has no idea that's happening. That's such a good rib, a gentle rib that doesn't hurt anybody. And that's what Vic Christie is known as.
Oh, and see, that's why you wear a ring jacket. The second comes and takes. Go back old school here. So let's talk about a guy who has a very special trivia note to Portland wrestling. Let's talk about C.W. Bergstrom.
C.W. Bergstrom was the very last Northwest champ for the Dono in Portland wrestling.
So tell me, what was C.W.'s role in Portland? How did he get to that point where they would give him the championship?
Yeah, I'm not sure. CW was kind of the underneath guy, the opening match guy for quite a few years. He had some size to him. He grew up with Matt Bourne. That's kind of his claim to fame. He was trained by Matt Bourne. He went down to Texas, trained by Bourne and the grappler. And this is my favorite part of the interview, and this had to have been a rib on him. His very first match was against Bruiser Brody. Yeah, he might have been just the last man standing here to end up with the Northwest title. I'm not really sure. He wasn't really involved in a lot of angles, feuds. He just ended up with the title.
And we will say CW, when we talk about some of the guys that were in Portland, CW was really fairly tall, wasn't he?
He had some good size to him. That was the one thing where I think Don saw some potential in him.
And he had fairly long blonde hair. So he fit the mold of the baby face that was going around at that time in wrestling, especially in the Northwest. And he's still alive, still living around the Portland area and in good shape. That was C.W. Bergstrom. And he debuted in 1987. He was here to the very end of Portland wrestling. Even after Portland wrestling, when Sandy started running promotions, he wrestled for Sandy, didn't he?
Yeah, and he also did some booking with the Kafori version of Portland wrestling. He continued on after Don Owen had quit. He has an interesting take on booking. He said in the interview it was a little bit hard to get everybody on the same page. And that's probably every booker anywhere has always said something similar to that.
And that will take me back to the Grapplers interview where you ask him about booking in Portland and coming in and if he had any difficulty. He said the hard part was getting people to understand that you weren't going to win every match, that there was going to be people that were losing, and that he wasn't there for everybody to be best friends. He was there to book and to make money. And that's what made him successful. Where he says Rip was kind of the opposite and had everybody kind of as friends and not really pushing anybody in particular.
Yeah, and I've heard a number of different people say that Grappler was straight up business. And once the business was addressed, then he was back to being one of the boys. So he had that really good way of separating the two when they needed to be separated.
And I just came up with another idea for money here, Mike. I know you like it, but in the interview, he mentioned that he had an alias for a while, and that was as the Butcher, and that he wore a mask and had a bloody butcher smock. So who else have we talked about that was a butcher? Haru Sasaki.
That's right.
So the blood, nobody had seen Haru around for a number of years. The Butcher took out Haru Sasaki.
Oh, no.
You never saw Haru with the Butcher, did you?
Oh, that's true. Never saw them together.
Oh, another person that you never saw C.W. Bergstrom with was Butts Gerard, which is a great name. But he was active in the Portland sports arena from 1970 to 74. So people who watch those tapes will find matches of his out there. He started wrestling in Vancouver in 1970, and his very second match was in Portland, and it was against Dutch Savage. That had to be a little tough.
He talks about Dutch Savage being somewhat of a mentor for him. So there's somebody else who appreciated Dutch Savage. We're on a roll. I remember a match that Butts Gerard had. Butts didn't remember this match, but it was unique because she was wrestling Dutch Savage and Butts was wearing a toupee. And the toupee came off during the match. And I just remember Savage belly laughing about this and holding up the toupee. And of course, that enraged Butts Gerard.
Butts was a pretty good athlete. He played in the Canadian Football League for several seasons. He's in the Western Washington University Hall of Fame. But he has another very distinct accomplishment. Mike, do you know what that is?
Yeah, we've talked about the wide world of sports, on a couple of recent podcasts. Butts Gerard was on the wide world of sports in the belly flop contest. They Wide World of Sports we've talked about always had a variety of unusual sports. I'm watching this, of course, one Saturday afternoon, and I hear Butts Gerard, and I look up, and it's like there he is winning the championship belly flop contest.
And he competed in 75, 76, 78, and 80. So wouldn't that have made a great finisher for him? Because he wasn't a small guy. I mean, he wasn't thin, but a top rope or running off the ropes and doing a body splash, because he could have really splashed the guy.
Money. It's money.
See, if we need to redo this thing here. Now, I really enjoyed his talk about wrestling injuries because recently on a Jim Cornette drive-through, there was a question from some fan who said, how do guys handle things when mistakes happened in the ring and someone got hurt? And I'm like, this guy probably started watching wrestling in 1995. But Jim was very nice about it, talked a little bit, kind of skated around the locker room happenings. But here's how Butch Gerard handled a mistake in the ring. He says he's wrestling Duncan McTavish and Dean Higuchi. He says, I can't remember who my partner was, but he says Duncan McTavish was a good wrestler, but he gave me a shot in the eye and I didn't like it much. So I smacked him back and ended up getting DQ'd. Now, I'm in with Dutch Savage, Gene Kaninsky, The Brute, John Quint, and all the bad guys in the dressing room. That's some tough people to be in, isn't it, Mike?
Oh, yeah. That's a crew. That's a crew to draw to.
So he says Duncan comes through the door and he cold cocks me on the side of his head. I didn't even see it coming. He just hit me as hard as he could, but he didn't hit me anywhere that it hurt. Like he gets hit as hard as he can in the side of the head and it doesn't hurt. I think if people give me enough money on my Venmo when I set you up, that's going to be the first move, someone hitting you on the side of the head, because it's probably not going to hurt. He says, I just looked at him. The next thing I knew, I was bashing his head against the cement locker by the wall. Blood was everywhere. A few seconds later, I caught myself and said, wow, what am I doing? I'm going to kill this guy. After that, I never had a problem. John Quinn said he would never forget it. He goes, I went unglued. I was always fairly well-mannered, obviously. I like to help other people rather than get in the way. You have to make a stand for yourself. I'm glad I stopped because I like Duncan. He was a nice guy. From that day on, no one messed with me. John Quinn is a character. He said, Butts, I'll never forget that you scared the heck out of me. After that, I stayed away from you. I'm not sure what mild-mannered Butts Gerard. It clearly was not this.
And interestingly, Gerard is still alive. I believe he's about 80 years old. One more interesting note about this interview. Butts lives in British Columbia somewhere. I called him to do the interview. It would have been cheaper for me to fly and do this interview with Butts Gerard face to face over what my phone bill was. There's nothing bad about Butts Gerard, but I wouldn't have paid nearly $300 to get this interview. I don't know if I would have paid $300 for a Lou Thez interview, but God bless Butts Gerard and buy the book because I'm still paying on that phone bill.
People today say, well, how come it was so much? Back then, it was a landline. You were calling international. And so it was so much per minute, depending upon the time of day you called. It could run up to $200 to $300 really quickly.
Really quickly.
How was your expression when you opened the phone bill?
Yeah, not pleased.
So it wasn't like you got hit on the side of the head and it didn't hurt.
Not at all.
I also think it's interesting because we don't remember him as being a big star, but he says he wrestled in Baghdad and Kuwait in front of 135,000, as he calls them, Arabs. He says he even got some film of that with Billy White Wolf. And we know Billy White Wolf had a large wrestling match over there, but I had not realized Butts Gerard was in on it.
Yeah, it sounds like he spent some time in England and Great Britain because he talks about having friends who wrestled in Vancouver, Wayne Bridges, Mal Kirk, and Sean Reagan, and that he was interested in going over to England for their reunions and things. And he felt like he knew those guys better than he knew the guys in the Northwest.
And I will say we've talked about gimmicks and some are good and some are bad. But on his first trip over to England, he was the All-American and wore a football helmet. Mike, I'm not sure about that gimmick. I'm just going to tell you that right now. It's not but it was in England. So let's move on to a guy who was here for a couple of years, and that was Bobby Kincaid.
Bobby Kincaid spent a lot of time in Vancouver. He's better known as Bobby Bass, no class Bobby Bass. He is still alive and spends some time in Cauliflower Alley and is often teased and ribbed while he's there. He didn't win a lot of matches while he was here in Portland. He had more success in Tom Coe's Vancouver promotion, but a very nice man.
It's interesting you mentioned he didn't win a lot. And in Portland, his only win at the Portland Sports Arena was in January of 1979, where he beat Lanny Poffo. But then in Salem, Eugene, and Seattle, he had victories over Coco Samoa, Johnny Eagles, Lanny Holiday, Hector Guerrero, and of course, Sandy Barr. So Portland didn't always have the same winners that they did in Salem and Eugene and Seattle, did they?
No, different bookers, sometimes they didn't follow the pecking order precisely. So that's made it kind of interesting as well.
And you always ask all of your interviews, a great first question is, how did you get into wrestling and who trained you? Most of them say, well, I remember watching it on television with my family and I wanted to go and be this for my whole life. But he says he wasn't even a fan of wrestling growing up. He says, I was sitting at the breakfast table and my dad was sitting there. And I'm not sure how this fits into the parenting 101. But his dad's sitting there and he said, he held the newspaper and he said, hey, Dennis, I think this is something you're big enough to do. I said, what's that, Pop? He said, pro wrestling. So I don't know if his dad was thinking that that was all he could do was be a pro wrestler, but that's how he got involved. He said Billy Watson Jr. and Phil Watson trained him at Sully's gym, and that's how he got started. Most everybody you interviewed was always a fan of wrestling growing up.
Yeah, that's true. He goes down into the southern states and he becomes part of the Bass Brothers group with Bob Bass. And he teamed with Don Bass. There was Ron Bass, who became the more famous wrestler who wrestled here as Sam Oliver Bass. In the interview, he talks about Ron Bass breaking his leg. So Bobby Bass becomes part of that team, the third brother. Never teams with Ron Bass. There's confusion at times about the Bass brothers since they switch in and out, but he finds success, especially with Ma Bass, being part of the crew there. It's a compelling team for sure.
I love Ma Bass. Pictures of her and read stories about her. She's someone everyone should look up. And Mike, I know the part of the interview you really want to talk about. So let's talk about his match with Eric Froelich.
Well, Eric Froelich, he says Eric Froelich was one of the first matches he ever had in the Northwest. He says, I came in as a smartass thinking I knew it all. And I'll tell you who put me in my place. And that was Eric Froelich. He taught me a lesson. He helped me understand the business a whole lot better than I understood it. He was a great guy. At the time of the interview, he was still alive and looking forward to seeing him, Eric Froelich. He was quite the worker. And he goes, and you learn from guys like that. Well, same thing that I've been telling you.
Yeah, I know. In Portland, he used the name Bobby Kincaid, didn't he?
Yes. And it very well might be because Ron Bass was here. That would have been confusing. So they switched up the names.
They couldn't have even had Bobby Bass as a brother or cousin because Bobby Kincaid looked absolutely nothing like Ron Bass.
Yeah, exactly.
And you always ask him, did you have any injuries during your career? And I love the story because I love Chris Colt's stories. He said he had his teeth knocked out with brass knuckles by Chris Colt. He goes, that was a mistake. You think so? He said, I made a move, Ron made a move, and Chris let his hand go, and we had real brass knuckles. He caught me in the mouth, and my teeth went left, right, and center. Chris grabbed me and said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I answered him with, he said he went to the hospital for 3 days. They had to wait for the swelling to go down. Real brass knuckles. Not a lot of real brass knuckles in professional wrestling anymore.
Yeah, leave it to Chris Colt.
You can never have it too many Chris Colt stories, can you?
No.
So there's a few more interviews we want to talk about. Let's talk about a guy who I have a special connection with, and that's Johnny Eagles.
Johnny Eagle, in his interview, he came to Portland and he was very unique. He had that English style. They called him the Houdini of wrestling, the wrestler with 1,000 holds. It was really fun to watch him wrestle because he would show a lot of leverage, along the lines of today's Zack Sabre Jr. He would do simple movement of wrists or knees and mesmerize the other wrestler. And then he would somehow be out of the hold if he was on the defense.
You mentioned the eagle on his chest. He actually got it when he was 18 and fairly thin. You can find a picture of him. And, if those of us that have tattoos know that as our bodies change, the tattoos tend to look a little different. So as he got older and put on some weight, the eagle on his chest expanded because when he was 18, it actually looked pretty small on his chest. But there were not a lot of tattoos in wrestling in like 1961 through early 70s, were there?
No, there really wasn't. I remember one wrestler in that time period by the name of T.G. Stone. He just had a lot of tattoos and looked unique. I remember Dutch Savage, who was doing interviews at the time, not made fun, but kind of bad talked this T.G. Stone. He said, "My body is a temple, and I would never put tattoos on my body." So Dutch Savage sneaks into this story as well.
And you ask him about his training, and you talked about him able to look like he's maneuvering body parts and stuff, but he trained in Wigan with wrestlers like Billy Robinson, Carl Gotch, John Foley. And you ask him, how do you think this training was different than the traditional training in the US? And his answer is great. He said, we used to wrestle to make your partner quit, not pinned.
And 4 years of training. And I said, I'm thinking like, is he feeling like he's ready to be in front of crowds? When is this training going to end? I mentioned the length of training. Did he get frustrated? His answer was every day he was frustrated.
And he teamed with Jeff Ports, which was an interesting team in Portland.
Yeah, they had some English rules matches at times. How many falls could be kind of like a duration match, and there was time limits involved. They'd have like 5-minute rounds, something a little bit different.
Even though they were successful as a team, he never won a tag title in the Northwest.
No, that and he was up the cards far enough to earn that. But I think you have Jimmy Snuka and Dutch Savage here at that time, and they just kind of had the titles all tied up all through their run.
And sometimes, as we mentioned, you can be successful and be looked at as a good team without winning the titles, as Ripper Collins and Greg Valentine in Portland. Isn't that correct?
Right, exactly.
Because they won the Hawaii tag titles, didn't they?
Yes,
Do you
yes,
know
they
where I
did.
found that information?
Well, I bet I do.
Where would I learn that?
I bet it's from, oh yeah, the history of Hawaiian wrestling.
That's right. And it's available on Amazon. Everyone needs that book. So I said that I have a little bit of linkage with Johnny Eagle. So after wrestling, as you ask him, what did he do? He said he did some different shots at television announcing. He did the wrestling announcing for Pacific Coast Championship Wrestling, him and Cliff Zonner. And Johnny and Cliff had a problem with the promoter, as my understanding, that they wouldn't stop talking about steroid use of a certain wrestler. Hughes talked about it all the time, and that happened to be Ole Olsen they were talking about. And they wouldn't stop talking about it, and for that reason, they got replaced. And that is how myself and Mark Marshall, who used to work at Don Costa's Hispanic radio station in Woodburn, Oregon, got the job. And we did Pacific Coast Championship Wrestling for the short duration that they were in business. So, Johnny Eagles, thank you much. One of the guys at Pacific Coast Championship Wrestling that I called a match for was Joey Jackson, who is still active in the wrestling business, doing some shows and promotional work. Let's talk about Joey Jackson.
Joey Jackson was trained by the Grappler. He came into the Northwest and debuted here. There's a real interesting part in the interview where Don Owen comes up and introduces him, and they're going to get to know each other a little bit. Don sits down with him and asks him, how long have you been wrestling, Joey? Joey says, well, including tonight, this will be my first match. And then I love this aspect of the interview because it shows you the humor of Don Owen. Most people will say Don Owen was great. He paid fair, but they never really touch on what Don Owen was like. Joey Jackson comes back and Don goes, that was your first match. Good job. And then he turns to Mike Miller and he's teasing Miller. He goes, he's already a better worker than you. I love that. I love that. It's like Don had a sense of humor, and just that little story relates it.
Can you imagine what went through Don's mind as soon as Joey said, well, including tonight, my first one. Don, his choices were either choke the grappler or find humor in the situation because Don wasn't booking people who had never worked matches.
Although I think Don gives chances to people, maybe not their first match. Some through at the encyclopedia, there's a few who get their first match, but you don't want that to be in Portland and on TV. And I think if I remember right, Joey Jackson talks about his match being in Hood River, his debut match. So that's a nice out of the way spot show. If he messes up, not too many people are going to know about it.
And it does give you an insight into how much Don trusted the grappler to bring in who was necessary. Because in 86 through 87, the business is starting to go down a little bit. 86 better than 85, but not a great time. So obviously money and payouts were going to be an issue Grappler was going to be dealing with. But Don had to have trusted him to bring him in there. You mentioned the sense of humor. Don Owen actually gave Joey Jackson his nickname, didn't he?
Yeah, gorgeous Joey. And Joey's like, who's that? He goes, that's going to be you, gorgeous Joey Jackson. Joey always had the hairbrush. Joey had a great head of hair, that's for sure. And he had this hairbrush that he always would bring to the ring and bring a mirror to the ring and be brushing his hair. And that helped him get some heat.
And it's so easy to do. People always want to make getting heat hard. It's so easy. He can just prance around and comb his hair and not let the bell ring to start the match because he's still combing his hair. Really simple stuff that somebody with not a lot of experience can then get some ring time because the match is going a little bit longer because he's combing his hair. Very smart. And he liked Don Owens a lot.
He speaks very highly of Don, and his length of time spent here shows that Joey was somebody that Don wanted to continue to book.
But then in 89, Joey said it was time to leave, and he lost a lose leave town match to Top Gun. Why was he leaving?
I think he was going back to Louisiana. He ends up wrestling there. That was his home, and since he has started a promotion there and has a chance to be a promoter, not just a wrestler. One other Joey Jackson memory that I have, for a very short time, he went over to Billy Jack's promotion. And on the debut of Billy Jack's promotion, he wrestles Hardboiled Haggerty, who's better known as Tugboat. And I remember that match. To get Haggerty over, he was stiff. He was very stiff. And I mentioned that to Joey. I said, that match looked a little stiff. And he affirmed it was very stiff.
Oh, Joey Jackson. And he's going to be at the Portland Wrestling Expo coming up here in February. So if you're around and want to talk to Joey, be sure to buy a ticket and talk to Joey. He talked about an injury. As I said, you always ask questions about their injuries. And he said, one time I got a horrible black eye that lasted for 4 months. They were wrestling the Southern Rockers at that time, which was Scott Peterson and Steve Dahl. He said Scott Peterson was dropping an elbow on me, but the fist went right into my eye. So he missed it by that much. He says it knocked me out for a moment because when I came to, it was Steve Dahl that was picking me up, not Scott. I started wailing on Steve, and he told me I was hitting the wrong guy. See, Scott Peterson knew tag out right away. Scott Peterson, smart wrestler. Okay, Mike, and before we talk about our next interview, I want you to listen to this.
Well, they're glad to have you back, Mike, but like you said, things have been happening here in the PCCW. You're looking for someone in particular?
Well, just like I said, I've been calling back home. I've been getting all the information. I heard Rip the Crippler Oliver and Tiger Chung Lee have a big deal going on. And I'll tell you what, Tiger Chung Lee, when you mess around with the Crippler, baby, you mess around with bad news. He's going to put something on you you can't get off. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, the golden voice you heard there was me. That was my first live interview in front of a wrestling audience, and it was in Pacific Coast Championship Wrestling in 1988, and I was interviewing the mean man himself, Mike Miller. So, Mike, let's talk about a guy who really advanced his career in Portland, and that's the mean man himself.
Yeah, he came into Portland in 1982. He's on the undercard, a heel. he had this look about him, just like he rode in off the desert. He wasn't really a cowboy, but he just had that look about him, a greasy look. His hair was long. He had a great facial hair, kind of like a Dutch Savage goatee, mustache, but scraggly, like it hadn't grown in all the way. He had a great heel look. And he had charisma. And we interviewed him in volume 3, and we talked a little bit about his charisma. And he mentions Chris Colt had a kind of a compliment for him, and he said, Miller, you make black look colorful. And so Miller took that as a compliment. He started out here, worked about 6 months, left and went to Calgary, stayed there about 7 months, came back to Portland, and was about a notch higher then. He'd pick up a few wins. And then we're talking about 1983, I believe. He injures his leg wrestling Jules Strongbow. And it's funny when you think about it, that was actually the turning point of his career, as far as now when he comes back, he's got issues. But he describes how he got injured. It was a spot where Jules Strongbow had slid under Miller's legs and then reached up and slugged Miller. Miller goes to do the same maneuver and he's going to outsmart Jules Strongbow, but when he slides, he had a wedge in his boot and it got caught. And then his knee just buckled the way it wasn't supposed to go, and he tore his Achilles. And he told Strongbow to go home, that he couldn't walk then. And he talks a little bit about medical issues, and I'm not sure about wrestling and medical issues.
He describes Rip Oliver coming over in the locker room, grabbing him, took his boot off. He said Harley Race was there, and he came over and said, "Kid, are you okay?" I said, "Man, my ankle and leg are killing me." And Race says, "Here, take these." And he opened my mouth and gave me 2 of something I don't know. Now, number one, Mike didn't open his mouth. Harley opened Mike's mouth and popped him in. Mike, the Portland Wrestling Medical Team is starting to come together. We've got Gene Kaninsky taping guys up like he did with Dory Funk Jr. We've got Sandy Barr putting Brad Anderson's nose back in place that we've talked about. And as an intern, and we didn't talk about this yet, but Jesse Barr tried to put John Rambo's nose back in place after Art Barr shot on him. It would not stay back in place. It kept going back to the side. And
Sounds
now
like
we have...
Sounds like that's the Barr specialty, the nose maneuver back into place.
Oh, and now we have pain medication being distributed by Harley Race. That's absolutely perfect. You mentioned him going to Calgary. I don't think he was really enjoying that time up there, learning for sure, but he says he went to Calgary for Stu Hart. He goes, it was an experience. Now, if somebody doesn't describe it as a really good time, they just describe it as an experience. You can read between the lines. So he says, then I kept calling Rip Oliver, kept calling him and telling him he needed to get me out of here. So he finally said, Rip, Don has a spot for you. And 7 months later, he's back in Portland. We've talked about Stu Hart, and we talked about the flipping the pancakes with the spatula and picking up the cat crap or the cat in the bowl and then making the salad. But he has a story that I wanted to cover, and that's Stu Hart and one of his sons, Wayne, who was the youngest of the kids. And Wayne was about to head off to college. He had long hair, and Stu said, you need to get your hair cut. And Wayne told him, look, I'm a man. Now, right there, you know this is not going to go well for Wayne, don't you? They have this huge table with 13 kids, and there's an issue. And Stu sits at the head, and Wayne will sit down at the other end. Stu said, I thought I told you to get a haircut. They start arguing, and Stu gets up, pushes the table forward, and pins Wayne against the wall. Stu gets up on the table, gets a knife, and starts cutting Wayne's hair.
Can you imagine Stu Hart on the dinner table with a knife crawling towards Wayne? That's like something out of Pulp Fiction.
It might be Parents of the Year. I'm not sure. Get your hair cut. I think there's a lot of songs about that. But Mike talked really nicely about Don Owen and said that he was always a very straightforward guy, treated him pretty well. But he had some great quotes that fit Don. He said that he would go to Don and give an idea about a match, and if Don liked it, he'd keep it. in the back of his mind, and he would tell you, well, that idea might be pretty good, but Jesus Christ, gas is up, groceries are up, and I don't know if people are going to be showing up. He talks about Buddy Rose and what a great mind for the business he had with him and Ed Wiskowski, and anything they came up with was money. And so he would talk about, Don would say, Jesus Christ, I might be closing next Saturday night. The loggers aren't working and the sawmills are shutting down. Mike says, I heard that for about 30 years. And again, in 83, he says, Don came to the dressing room and said, Jesus Christ, you had better find someplace to go. I'm probably going to be shutting down next week. He says, I've been hearing that for 8 or 9 years. I always heard that. That's Don Owen, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we mentioned that injury to Miller, tore his Achilles, which in football is like a year-long recovery when you tear your Achilles. And he says he did that on October 16th, and Christmas night, he was back wrestling again. So like just a little over 2 months. Maybe the Portland medical team's got something on the ball here.
It's those magic Harley race pills.
But so at the beginning of 84, he's just come off that issue with Jules Strongbow, still at the lower part of the cards, but he makes this, and he claims that it's just like all the other good wrestlers left, and he was the one to rise to the top. But he had some ability, he had some charisma. He did move up when other guys left, but which is really unusual in Portland. Usually you get a spot, you leave, and then you come back, and then you're moving up the cards. He was here and he just stayed. And by the end of 1984, he's main eventing Christmas night. And that's a big tip of the hat to him. From that point on, he's in main events, 85, 86. And then he has a babyface turn at some point there towards the end of 86, beginning of 87, and carried him through until the Grappler comes. And then that's the first real feud that the Grappler has is with Mike Miller.
And to show how much he had moved up from the preliminaries. And he had a fairly good, pretty good interview style, pretty believable for whether it was the face or the heel. You really believed what he talked about. But in 85, as the Northwest Heavyweight Champion, he wrestled Rick Martel at the first extravaganza. And that has to be, as they say, a real feather in the cap, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that card is absolutely loaded. You know that Martel's not going to lose the AWA championship on a card in Portland. So Miller's a great choice. It doesn't hurt Miller at all. He's elevated to that match. So when he loses, it doesn't hurt him at all.
And he had good size to him.
Yeah, exactly. And he was. I bet he was about 6'2" and probably a good 260. He was in decent shape for that frame. But yeah, I think his biggest attribute is that greasy look that he had about him. And he just looked like a heel. But then it worked when he turned babyface as well, because you know what? He truly is a likable person. And I think even when he's coming across as a heel and he'd been here for so long, people recognize that he is a genuinely nice person.
He genuinely is a nice person. And we saw him at the last Portland Wrestling Expo last year. He still looks in great shape. But Mike Miller and Joey Jackson, who was coming to the next expo, I worked with both of them at Pacific Coast Championship Wrestling. Very nice people. And you don't find a lot of, well, truthfully, there's not a lot of really nice people in Portland wrestling all the time. But he talks about one last story. We'll finish with this, and that's, he talks about Matt Bourne, because he and Matt Bourne rode around a lot together. And he says Matt was a great guy. He was just high strung. That's one way to put it. He says, one night I pulled into the Bomber and there were 6 police cars and they stopped me. Matt was in the car with me. He just opened the door and hauled ass. The cop said, was that Matthew Bourne? I said, yes. He said, I don't know why he's running. We're not after him. That's
a great story.
That's classic Matt Bourne. Another guy who has some great Facebook posts from time to time, and that's Frank Dusek, who you interviewed.
I find this interview really interesting. His career lasted from 1978 to 1989. He came into Portland. He's billed as part of the famous Dusek brother family. He told me his dad was Wally Dusek. He said that he knew he wanted to become a wrestler 3 days after he learned that it was a work. He had seen a lot of wrestling. He said that he wasn't really trained. His training was just from watching wrestling. His first match is with Tommy Ziegler. He's in Texas. Gary Hart sends him to Portland. He had thought about going to San Antonio, but there was a break in the promotions there. Joe Blanchard was going to start running San Antonio. Gary Hart says, "You go to Portland, don't go to San Antonio. If you go to San Antonio, you're going to be blackballed from wrestling forever." Frank Dusek says, "I better go to Portland." Now, this part I find really interesting because Portland was packed when he came in. You've got the Sheepherders, Buddy Rose, Ron Bass, Stasiak, Piper Martell. It's that plum time, one of the best times ever in Portland. And Dusek comes in. He's kind of slotted to be a mid-card wrestler, I believe. He talks about the very first night, somehow he gets heat with Buddy Rose. And he indicated that he thought he and Buddy Rose would make a good tag team. And somehow he felt that Buddy was threatened by that. He felt like he was not going to get used very well in Portland since he had heat with Buddy Rose. But my memory is, with all those names we just talked about, you would not think that there was room for Frank Dusek to climb to the top of the cards. And he did. He was a heel. He and Rose did have a breakup. Dusek becomes a babyface and gets in the main events. I remember at the time, I was surprised with all those wrestlers, Stasiak and Bass and Piper, Martell and the Sheepherders. I was very surprised that they moved Dusek up into the main events. He got some tag main events, some six-man, and some singles main events.
And you mentioned that had come into Portland with just under a year of experience. When you're looking at the talent that you mentioned, it was one of the hottest times for quite a few years, 79 through 80, because Martell came in at the end of 1979 and was here through 80. So that was a really hot time. The Sheepherders were killers at that time, not the comedy team that they became, but really that bloody tag team, kind of like the early Kangaroos were. And so they must have seen something in him. He had decent size, but when you put a guy with some talent and a understanding of the business, you put him in with some of those guys that you mentioned, they can lead a guy to a really good match, which really shows you the talent and how good the other wrestlers in Portland were.
Yeah, exactly. And then he and Buddy Rose in the dressing room evidently came to blows, and Frank Dusek knew it was time to leave. He talks about Ron Bass getting him into Mid-South wrestling. Frank Dusek became part of the office in Mid-South and became part of the office in Dallas and kind of eased his way out of active wrestling and more into office work. Another interesting thing is Frank Dusek was the owner of the website Wrestling Classics, which is still active today. I don't know if he still is involved with that website, but still a top-notch historical wrestling site.
Those were great days when you could go onto the Wrestling Classics and see who was posting from all over, and it was really well monitored. That was a great website. I don't know if people still post, but it's something people should go. You can learn a lot. Let's talk about that Rose dressing room incident. He said, "I was one of several to do this, so it wasn't exactly news or an accomplishment." He says, "I insulted his parents and tried everything I knew to get that coward to act like a man." I don't think there was any going back from that when Buddy Rose and him were feuding. Do you think?
Yeah, that's probably like giving your notice.
That's probably yeah, something like that. Interesting trivia note that this will probably come up in a future episode, Mike. You mentioned that there were 5 Dusek brothers, Ernie, Rudy, Joe, Emmett, and his dad, Wally. They wrestled out of the New York wrestling office that was located in the old King Edward Hotel. The King Edward Hotel is the home of the fictional TV cop, Beretta.
Don't go to bed with no price on your head. No, no. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time. Yeah. Don't do it. And keep your eye on the sparrow.
you go. Beretta was a great show. Those were great cop shows back then. So we got just a couple more to talk about. Let's talk about Klondike Mike, Norman, Mock and Sing. Now, he had a lot of different names and had a good career under a bunch of different names.
Yeah, he started in Vancouver under the Klondike Mike name, came down to Portland a time or two, really reached success in Calgary under the name Mahak and Singh, and ended up going into WCW as Norman the Lunatic, and then unfortunately ended up as just a horrible gimmick in WWE. I even forget the name of it.
Bastion Booger.
Bastion Booger. In the interview, if I remember right, I asked him about that interview, and he said he didn't know how it came to be, but he got to watch it die.
He said, I look at that character and I see Red Rooster all over again. Oh, Terry Taylor, there you go. How did you get in contact with Klondike Mike or Norman Mike Shaw?
I was going to Calgary for that big Stu Hart show, and I had let him know that I was going to be there. And I had a chance to meet him in the airport very briefly. We shook hands. And I know this is interesting, and asked Ed Moretti about this. He had, as I watched him walk, he had kind of a peculiar little gait to his step. And I asked Ed about that, what that was about. And it was kind of compulsive behavior where he can't step on a crack. And that adjusted his gait. It was so pronounced and so noticeable that I asked Ed about it. Ed had known him earlier. I've told the story before. On the way to the matches, Dr. Mike Leno will get you places that you didn't think you could get. And we saw a limo pull up. Mike Shaw got in the limo, and we got in the limo right with him. I'll never forget. I was very embarrassed. His look was, even though he had met me, written all over his face, or what are you guys doing in my limo? It's like, we're going to the matches, Mike.
Mike Leno isn't known for being shy, is he?
No, you're going to the matches? We're going to the same place? Let's go.
And it's a limo.
Sure.
Oh my gosh, that is absolutely hilarious. And so Norman, he really enjoyed Norman as his favorite character. He mentioned that in the book. And he was that lunatic type guy, but he could really get into the character and he knew people enjoyed it. So as wrestlers develop their character, do something that you enjoy and something that people can resonate with.
Yeah, absolutely. He had a chance to show different sides of his ability with all the different characters.
Frank, it's that time.
Yes, Lisa. But Mike, you hear that music, so you know it's time for Kayfabe Curveballs, where trivia and reality blur. Lisa's going to hand me 3 questions. They could be wrestling related. At least one always will be. But we'll see how much Mike knows about stuff outside of wrestling. If you've been following along, you know Mike has really nailed every single one of these questions. Okay, Lisa, tonight's questions, please.
Here you go.
Thank you. Oh, Mike, listen to this. Oh, that's the theme to Marcus Welby, MD, an ABC show from 1969 to 1974 featuring Robert Young. It featured the aged Welby, who was always looking for unconventional treatments for patients, and he was going toe-to-toe with the straight-laced methods of Dr. Kiley, played by a youthful James Brolin, and maybe would win the vote for the blandest TV theme song ever. It's terrible. So your question is in line with Welby's efforts, Mike. In 1830, what condiment we use today was used as medicine?
Salt.
Oh, the answer is actually ketchup. It was touted by Dr. James Cook as a cure for indigestion, diarrhea, and jaundice. He even believed it cured tuberculosis. Over the years, ketchup's medicinal claims started to lose credibility, but it continued on to be a much-used condiment. But think about it. You need your kids to take their medicine, and we all know that that can be a chore. Back then, if they didn't want the medicine, you just poured it over their French fries. It's almost like a spoonful of sugar. Just so that you know, I don't like ketchup. The only time I use ketchup is on a meatloaf sandwich. Good. But on anything else, I never use ketchup. Okay, Mike, listen to this. It's another song. What a great song. It's from 1879 and it's called the Alamo March. The Alamo. You should probably go visit it one day. But your question is, what does the Spanish word Alamo mean?
I should know this. I'm going to say waving of the flag.
No, you're not even close. The answer is cottonwood. The area around the Alamo is dense with cottonwood trees. Now, the National Forest Service uses cottonwoods to stabilize stream banks, and they act as a natural waterway filtration system, and they reduce sedimentation. They tend to colonize and form groves that act as natural windbreaks. And the female cottonwood tree can grow up to 6 feet a year. The male, about 2 feet, because size matters. Okay, Mike, final clue.
Of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Yes, I replayed that from the last show, and that clip of "I'm not a crook" reminded me of Watergate and the missing 18 and a half minutes of the tape that doomed Nixon's presidency. Missing tapes. Mike, have you any wrestling-related stories about a missing portion of tape? Have you ever, true or false, been involved in missing tape?
I believe that I do have a story with that.
And you would be 100% correct. Mike, go ahead and tell us the story of missing tape and the Wrestling Commission.
So throughout the 80s, the 90s, we would go to Wrestling Commission meetings because oftentimes, to be honest, those meetings were way more interesting than the wrestling matches themselves. You'd get the behind the scenes of what these commissioners thought about, mostly about boxing, but wrestling would seep into it as well. And there were some really interesting meetings where Don Owen would show up. A lot of the wrestlers would show up. It came to a point where certain wrestlers were going to be licensed. Lots and lots of interesting issues and topics. But one time I was there, you were there. The three of us would often go to these meetings. And at this meeting, there was an issue that you were bringing up. You were interested in seeing if you could get wrestling for WB, the station that you were working at. And the whole issue hinged on one point. Would the commission consider it a TV show to be a little bit different scenario than an actual wrestling promotion? You know, the goal is to make TV rather than to run a promotion, as Don Owen, as Billy Jack had done, that needed some oversight and some rules and things. So the question was, would WB need to be licensed? I think that was the very, very focal question. Need to be licensed as a wrestling promotion to produce a wrestling TV show. That was very, very finely put. And the commissioners all looked at each other and glanced around the table, and one of them spoke up. No, I don't believe that to be the case at all. I remember that very well. The three of us looked at each other. We were rubbing our hands together. You know, you had the idea, and we had put our 2 cents in of details, and that was the green light, and the green light for you to go ahead and put together wrestling that appeared on WB. Now, we fast forward a few months after the promotion had not the promotion. The TV show product had started and aired on TV. Now we're at the next commission meeting, and they seem to have an issue. You just cannot put this on TV. You need to be licensed. And we said, oh no, don't you remember? You answered this question. And somehow, some way, the tape was produced and we were ready. They started playing the tape. And there was nothing that resembled any of our memories of what was on that tape. The question was not asked if there was going to be a license that needed to produce a television show. And we all looked at each other and just, what can you do? What actually happened, and unless we all were taking those Harley Race pills, what was on the tape did not match up with our memories at all.
Yeah, we had specifically said that we were never going to charge admission. It was a studio audience, like a TV game show where people come in and watch. That's how it was set up. That's how we ran the first few shows. And then we had received, Steve Dant, the station manager, and myself had received letters from the state attorney general telling us that we were going to go to jail if we produced another wrestling show. And yeah, the meetings are all, because they're public meetings, the meetings are all taped. And at that time, we didn't have cell phones, of course, like this. So that record everything. So they had these little tape recorders that they taped all the meetings. And who edited that tape? We have no idea. But that was the beginning of the end of Portland wrestling on the WB. And eventually I did get licensed and became a promoter on Comcast Sportsnet. But that is an absolute great story. Nixon and myself, kind of the same. And that's kayfabe curveballs, where trivia and reality blur. And Mike and I, sometimes we just have to shake our heads. So let's talk about, we got a crazy one coming up here. But before we get to the crazy one, let's talk about Mike Webster, who worked at the Sports Arena in 71, again in 73 and 74. Another of those Vancouver guys.
Yeah, Mike Webster was really an interesting interview. He came down one time to wrestle Beauregard in the main event. Interesting because he had never been in Portland, and he just came on down, and somehow it was a match to get Beauregard over. Beauregard, although being extremely popular, did not win very many singles, especially main event matches. So this was a match to get him over. Mike Webster, I found in his interview to be very intelligent. He was a football player. There was another Mike Webster, more famous football player, Hall of Fame. But this wrestler, Mike Webster, had a lot of success. I see he has a football card in the book when he played for the Montreal Alouettes, and he was a defensive tackle.
And he got out of wrestling because he was starting to have success, and there was talk of All Japan and World Championships. He says, I applied for grad school, and I couldn't see myself wrestling forever. So I worked with many older wrestlers whose bodies pained them every moment they were in the ring. I didn't want to end up like that. Again, I think of guys today, and I shake my head. You mentioned he was a very intelligent man. He applied to grad school.
Yeah, different pathways that you choose in life. He was going to be a successful wrestler. He got put on top, especially when he came back to Vancouver. He had his second run there. He was tag champs with The Brute. He had a successful pathway lined up in wrestling, but he decided that he didn't want to end up in the manner that he'd seen other old wrestlers, the beating of their body. And so he took another pathway and went back to school to enter a different profession.
It's so interesting that he had a great run up in Vancouver, but in Portland, like a number of guys, they were just filler in Portland, which is like you talked about in Hawaii, which is in, oh yeah, the history of Hawaii, wrestling available on Amazon, where guys in Hawaii, even though they were there, they weren't what was drawing the crowds. It was the main guys drawing the crowds. Same in Portland. Mike Webster would come down a star in Vancouver, but here he would just work the card while the money draw was the guys that were on top. Speaking of guys that are on top, Mike, in a match I know that I voted for as match of the year in 1974, and it was because of the result. And that was Mike Webster beat Eric Froelich in his only Portland match that year.
What are you going to do?
I also enjoy you asking about injuries. And he said, I was a bump man. I suffered no broken bones other than my nose. But it took 2 years for my bruised tailbone to heal after I stopped wrestling. You ask him about injuries, and he says, no broken bones and nose. Seems pretty okay, right? Oh,
yeah.
Then he continues. Other miscellaneous mishaps, he says, included being stabbed in Orlando, hit in the head with a bottle in Puerto Rico, having Carbona cleaning fluid poured over me in Tacoma, and receiving a dart in the thigh at Fort Myers, Florida. My nose was broke and I got stabbed, received a dart in the thigh, had cleaning fluid poured over me. How is that not at the top of the list?
Maybe that's more the reason why he decided to get out of the business.
I like he talked about working Lonnie Main in a match in Portland. And he expected Lonnie to come in because Webster was fairly new to the business. Lonnie was a star, and he thought Lonnie would just come in and squash him. But he said Lonnie was really generous and gave him a lot of offense, and they told a solid and believable story. Portland didn't use squash matches to get people over, did they? Because if he just squashes Mike Webster, it tells you that Mike Webster wasn't much.
And that means more to Lonnie because Mike Webster had some size to him. And, if you're able to beat somebody, that big and imposing, it means more for you. It reaffirms that you are one of the top wrestlers in Portland and that you can fend off these other big wrestlers.
So let's talk about Jeff Costa.
Jeff Costa is a character.
People need to get the book just to read Jeff Costa and talk about politicians.
Jeff Costa, I think, ran for president. He is also known as the Lobster Man, where he wrestles with lobster claws on his hands, and he has a singlet with a lobster on his stomach. He uses humor and topical topics to draw in crowds.
Now, you mentioned lobster hands. Okay, that's not really doing it justice because I think of he's wearing like these football gloves that are like a lobster. These are claws, big, giant lobster claws.
Yes, exactly.
How did he get it past the commission?
Yeah, that would be interesting to see the rule written, no lobster claws.
Why did he get out of wrestling as a serious wrestler and go into the comedy bit that was very successful for him?
I asked him, how did this come about? He says, Lobster Man is Bruiser Costa Light. In 1992, I opened a small promotion running maybe 40 shows a year, and I needed something for an attraction. I had a gym and I was training guys. When you train people, you at least owe it to them to put them to work. So I did. I created Lobster Man as a joke between Butcher Hughes and me, and I told him I was going to be a 300-pound lobster. Put it on a poster, and people will come to see the show. Well, it worked. Lobster Man was born. It snowballed from there. I had the gym for a few years, and a guy came in all hairy and nasty looking. He says he wants to be a wrestler. I said, okay, that sounds good. You look like a wolf man. He doesn't have any money, but he's willing to help put up the ring, load the truck, etc. I said, no money's okay. I can't afford to let this wolf man walk out the door. We'll work out something later.
That's a wrestling story.
Yeah.
So let me tell you about a couple parts of the interview that I found stunning. It stopped me in my tracks. He talks about a couple of wrestlers. You ask him about Jerry Morrow, and he said Jerry Morrow, along with Rick Steamboat, was one of the best-selling baby faces I've ever seen. I used to have to ask Jerry if he was okay. He convinced me I was killing him. That is a great wrestler.
We've always heard Jerry Morrow. Nobody sells like Jerry Morrow. Ricky Morton might be the only wrestler. Jerry Morrow sells like crazy.
And then he says one guy, when you ask him about a bunch of guys, he says one guy you didn't list that was really good was Bill Cody. I tagged with him a few times. He was the Scorpion or something. He was just visiting the area, but he was great. Bill Cody worked in Portland a few times. Not a guy I ever considered great, but obviously he was. And then this one, and it pains me. It's painful for me to talk about this. He talks about Eric Froelich. And we joke about Eric Froelich, but he says, I regard him as one of the most underrated wrestlers, not in Vancouver, not in Portland. I regard him as one of the most underrated wrestlers ever. A great gentleman. I don't even know how you published this interview in this book. Have you no scruples?
It just goes to show everything I've been telling you this whole time.
So you talked about he ran for president, and he really did use that as a gimmick to get over and to get people to come in. That was the Lobster Man for president. So another crazy wrestling story is Art Cruz, who had a career from 81, 82, 86, and 87, and then had an interesting career after wrestling. So let's talk about your interview with Art Cruz.
Art Cruz started here as a white meat babyface. One of the most to be honest, one of the most bland, boring wrestlers I'd ever seen as a babyface. And he's around in the 1981, 82. He comes back in 1987. He's put on some weight. His hair is now blonde. He's been around Kansas City and Mid-South. He's a much better wrestler. And now he's a heel. This was not a great time for Portland wrestling. And Art Cruz stood out so well during this time period. He was one of the better interviews. And I really thought he reminded me so much of Ripper Collins, because Ripper Collins had that crazy streak to him. And Art Cruz during this run had a crazy streak to him. And I really enjoyed his work here in that time period.
And you talked about the character development that he had. So he came back, not only had cut his hair, but he had over-the-top interviews and was making crazy faces. That's part of selling to the crowd and selling yourself, is the facials that wrestlers make in the ring to make people realize who you are and if you're being hurt or you're just going crazy in the ring. So he had some wins over a number of wrestlers, but then after wrestling, he became a correctional officer and worked in various prisons, which is probably a little more dangerous than working in the wrestling business, maybe just a little bit. And he had a stint on the Oregon Boxing and Wrestling Commission at a time when the commission was a little controversial, but Art wanted to bring in some rules and regulations to it, sort of like when Ed Moretti was on the commission.
Yeah, and he talks a little bit about that. Promoters have been very upset by the rules because they felt that they add a lot of extra time and money for the promotions. And the rules were there to protect the wrestlers, but at times they have cost the wrestlers bookings because some of the problems with the promoters. And he says, where's the balance? My take on this is that the rules were there to protect not only the wrestlers, but all parties. A promoter's bottom line is the cost of operation and net profit, and that's usually it. And he really wanted to find that balance to protect the wrestlers, help the promoters continue to put on wrestling shows, and to be one of the only, Ed Moretti was there in the commission, but to be the voice of pro wrestling on the commission. And that was lacking with the exception of Moretti and Cruz.
With that interview, we'll wrap up another episode of Ringside in Rose City. Thanks so much to everyone who tuned in, whether you've been with us from the beginning or just found the show. Be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube. And new episodes drop every Thursday. So you don't want to miss a single thing of what's coming next, because the envelopes on the wheel are full of surprises. And Lisa really wants to spin the wheel again. Don't you, Lisa? Also, make sure to visit Amazon and pick up one of Mike Rogers' wrestling books. They're packed with history, stories, and details that you won't find anywhere else. And so with that, I'm Frank Culbertson, and this is
Mike Rogers.
And as we say every week, that's wrestling. Wrestling the way it should be. Lisa, great job once again. Go ahead and take us home.
And that's a wrap from Ringside in Rose City, where one ring, one city, and 1,000 stories never fail to deliver. I'm Lisa Hughes, and this has been a Yaski production. Catch every episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your wrestling fix. Until next time, keep your boots laced, your popcorn buttered, and your stories ready.